CGI can make or break a movie. When you see something like Zodiac, Avatar, or Jurassic Park, the CGI pulls you in and immerses you in the world. This video is not about those kinds of movies. No, here I want to take a look at some of the worst CGI ever committed to the big screen. Some of it is a product of the time that the movie was released in, though more often it's a product of poor planning or budgeting. Rarely, however, is it because of the VFX crew. They're craftspeople that know their art inside and out, but they can only do so much, especially against the almighty deadline and dollar. 1992's The Lawnmower Man was one of the first movies to really explore VR and cyberspace, though Tron had done it about a decade earlier. It was loosely adapted from a Stephen King short of the same name. The director, Brett Leonard, and producer Gimel Everett had written their own screenplay about VR called Cyber God. Production company Allied Vision then incorporated that story into The Lawnmower Man, meaning the movie bears pretty much zero resemblance to King's original work. So much so that King sued and won $2.5 million from them. Leonard envisioned the film as a groundbreaking exploration of digital technology's potential, creating elaborate computer-generated sequences that were intended to represent the cutting edge of visual effects at the time. He was inspired after seeing an event put on by VPL Research, founded by Jaron Lanier in the 1980s, to create and sell VR products such as the Data Glove, whose tech was incorporated into Nintendo's Power Glove, the iPhone, which was a head-mounted display, and the Data Suit. It didn't last long, but it was a neat concept. Now, The Lawnmower Man is different from the other movies on this list in that its CGI is, I think, partially attributable to the time in which it was released. It had a lot of it, and the extensive CGI sequences were groundbreaking for their time, but they, by any measure, seem incredibly primitive and unconvincing by today's standards, resembling basic geometric shapes and simple animations more than a believable alternate reality. Tron had created a cyber world a decade prior, and in much of it, it does look a lot better than the results of The Lawnmower Man, though I suppose they were trying to go for different things. The VR sequences featured blocky, low-polygon digital environments with simplistic lighting and textures that failed to create any sense of immersion or believability even for their own time. Character movements within the digital space looked robotic and disconnected from realistic physics, while the interface between live action and computer-generated elements is often jarring and poorly integrated. The technology was certainly there, as movies like T2 Judgment Day and Jurassic Park illustrated, but then ILM was also the creme de la creme, cost a lot, and required a lot of time to get it right. The Lawnmower Man had a $10 million budget and did what they could with what they had. Amazingly, the movie did manage to turn a profit, and despite the result, it deserves praise for its ambitious vision. Now, it serves as a fascinating time capsule of early digital effects, demonstrating both the exciting potential and significant limitations of 1990s CG technology. Roger Ebert gave 1997 Spawn a glowing review and ended it with, quote, "As a visual experience, Spawn is unforgettable," end quote. He was right about that, and I'm on the side of people that do like Spawn. This was an attempt to bring Todd McFarlane's dark comic book anti-hero to the big screen. Michael J. White took on the lead role, and it was directed by a VFX guy in his directorial debut, Mark A.Z. DePay. He and the team had an ambitious goal: create a visually stunning supernatural action film that would push the boundaries of digital effects. The film aimed to capture the grotesque, hellish imagery of McFarlane's comic while appealing to mainstream audiences, requiring extensive use of then cutting-edge CGI to bring Spawn's demonic transformations and otherworldly environments to life. This was going to be unlike any of the superhero movie fare at the time, like the Superman and the Batman movies. The movie originally had a $20 million budget, but that kept ballooning until it got to around $45 million. A third of that was for the VFX work, a hefty chunk. But even this required a lot of crunch from the teams involved. More than 400 shots were split across 22 companies. Even then, according to an LA Times article from 1997, quote, "More than half the effect shots were delivered about 2 weeks before the movie's debut, as New Line was loath to spend more until it had seen a sample of the effects," end quote. Spawn's CGI problems are numerous and fundamental to the film's visual presentation, with the character's signature cape rendered as an unconvincing digital artifact that never appears to have weight or realistic interaction with the environment. The cape's movements appear artificial and disconnected from Spawn's body, floating and wriggling in ways that defy physics and break the illusion of the character's presence in the real world. The movie's hellish environments and demonic creatures suffer from similar issues, appearing as obvious CG elements that lack the texture and believability necessary to create genuine horror or atmosphere. They did use some practical effects mixed in with the digital, though the end result does leave one wanting. The CG was one factor in the film's negative reception, and I think it undermined the dark tone that the filmmakers were going for. The critical and commercial reception effectively nixed plans for a sequel. That said, I've always found it to be an enjoyable movie and would recommend that anyone watch it at least once. Sure, the CG leaves you wanting, but I applaud the ambition on display here. Ebert put it well at the beginning of his review, quote, "What we have here are creators in several different areas doing their best to push the envelope. The subject is simply an excuse for their art, just as it always is with serious artists," end quote. 2001's The Mummy Returns was the sequel to 1999's The Mummy, certainly one of my formative films. The movie starred Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, and were Indiana Jones-esque in how fun they were. The Mummy Returns attempted to expand the mythology while introducing new characters like the Scorpion King, played by The Rock in his debut. Despite the ambitious scope and increased budget, the film suffered from the studio's pressure to deliver spectacular visual effects on an unrealistic schedule. Now, for most of the film, the CGI is actually done well. The scenes with Imhotep were an improvement on the CGI that was done in the 1999 film. But the most infamous CGI disaster in The Mummy Returns is the digital recreation of Dwayne Johnson as the Scorpion King himself. What should have been the movie's crowning visual achievement instead became a laughably bad CG monstrosity that looked more like a video game cutscene from 2001 than a major Hollywood blockbuster effect. However, we have a reason as to why it's so bad. In episode 78 of VFX Artists React to Bad and Great CGI on the Corridor Crew channel, John Burton Jr., the production VFX supervisor on the movie and the one who called the visual effect A Dark Day in His Life, said that the issue came down to them not having a reference. In his segment, he explains that the VFX crew needed The Rock for a day in order to photograph his face and get the references that they needed, but The Rock was still in the WWE at the time and couldn't make it. In fact, they had to shoot all of his scenes in 3 days, as Burton said. It all came down to lack of time. The result was that the digital Rock's face appeared rubbery and unconvincing. It was a terrible Uncanny Valley-like effect, where the thing that you're seeing is apparently human-like, but something feels off, something that makes viewers uncomfortable. The entire Scorpion King creature also suffered from weightless movement and interactions that never felt grounded in the real environment, making fight scenes appear artificial. The movie made money, of course, but critics and audiences derided the Scorpion King scene. It stood out all the more considering the rest of the CGI was decent and that progress had been made over the years. It's just that this was a spectacularly bad effect, one that ended up overshadowing the rest of the movie. Die Another Day was Pierce Brosnan's final outing as James Bond in what was intended to be a celebration of the franchise's 40th anniversary, incorporating elements and references from throughout the series' history. It was also meant to be something of a bridge between millenniums, a movie that pushed Bond into the 21st century with cutting-edge tech and spectacular set pieces. MGM and the Broccoli's wanted to modernize Bond while retaining what made him great. Alas, the technological ambition would backfire spectacularly over the course of the film. One of the most notorious CGI disasters occurs during the scene where Bond surfs a wave after part of a glacier calves. The CGI is pretty unconvincing to say the least, and in parts he seems to be floating on the artificial water. It's not just the surfing though. The wave and collapsing ice effects lack realistic physics or danger, making the death-defying sequence look cartoonish rather than thrilling. As a matter of fact, this is a major complaint of pretty much all the bad CGI in this video. The CGI ends up reducing the heft and gravity of the scenes that they're meant to embellish. The result is cartoony physics, something that we pick up on instantly. You don't feel the impact, which lessens what should be heightened emotions, which is what cinema is all about. Roger Moore, who played Bond in 7 movies, was not a fan, saying, quote, "I thought it just went too far, and that's from me, the first Bond in space. Invisible cars and dodgy CGI footage, please," end quote. James Berardinelli, writing for Real Views, was much more emphatic, writing, quote, "Die Another Day is an excuse in loud explosions and excruciatingly bad special effects. The CGI work in this movie is an order of magnitude worse than anything I have seen in a major motion picture. Coupled with lousy production design, Die Another Day looks like it was done on the cheap," end quote. This was one of the campiest James Bond movies that we've got, and it usually ranks as one of the worst Bond films. Bond has always been campy to an extent, but the critical reaction forced a change in course for future movies. The Craig era would soon guide Bond towards a more grounded take. 2011's Green Lantern was part of DC's attempt to launch their own cinematic universe following the success of the burgeoning MCU and Nolan's revival of Batman. It starred Ryan Reynolds as Hal Jordan, who gets chosen to be the Green Lantern after the previous one, Abin Sur, dies. Warner Brothers poured a lot of money into this project, around $200 million, and they pretty much just set that all on fire. The film faced a lot of issues. It was stuck in development for a long time and went through script rewrites and directorial changes and no small amount of headaches trying to figure out how to bring this cosmic mythology to life on the big screen. Martin Campbell, who helped reinvigorate the Bond franchise, was chosen to direct and found himself navigating a heavily CGI-dependent production, which is something that he was not accustomed to. Alas, the film's ambitious digital vision far exceeded the time and bandwidth that the effects team had. The film's CGI problems are extensive and fundamental to its visual presentation, and none are more glaring than the Green Lantern's entirely digital costume, which never convincingly appears to exist in the real world. The suit looks like it was painted onto Reynolds in post-production, because it was, and lacked the weight, texture, and realistic lighting that would make it believable as a physical object. The constructs created by the Green Lantern's ring suffer from similar issues, appearing as weightless assets rather than solid objects that could realistically interact with the environment. Most problematically, the villain, Parallax, is rendered as an entirely digital cloud creature that lacks any sense of physical presence or threat, appearing more like an animated smoke cloud than an actual terrifying cosmic entity that's capable of destroying worlds. And keep in mind, 2011 was the year that Captain America was released. The budget numbers vary, but it was around or cheaper than Green Lantern. And instead of making a CG suit, they had a real one made for Chris Evans. The result was a superhero that, for all intents and purposes, existed in the real world. The VFX crew was worked to the bone on this movie. According to an April 2011 Variety article, quote, "The visual effects budget for Warner Brothers' Green Lantern has risen by $9 million, with new VFX houses recruited to bolster the team that's been working overtime to meet the film's June 17th launch," end quote. This, unfortunately, seems to be the norm on big-budget CGI-heavy movies. The $9 million was on top of the existing $45 million budget to get the roughly 1,400 VFX shots that they needed. The producers really have no one to blame but themselves for this one. To preface, I enjoy the Hobbit Trilogy. The movies were released during the late fall, early winter of 2012, 2013, and 2014, and I enjoyed seeing them in theaters with my friends. That said, it was a controversial return to Middle-earth. Jackson transformed a single book into 3 epic films using high frame rate technology and a lot of VFX. The goal, from the perspective of WB, New Line, and MGM, was maximum franchise exploitation of Tolkien's beloved story, which is an annual read for me and a lot of others. It was supposed to be directed by Guillermo del Toro in one of the great what-ifs of film history, but he left after MGM was slow-walking the production thanks to their money issues. Jackson then had to step in without a script in hand and not much prep done. Now, the Hobbit films are competently made. Peter Jackson is an excellent director, and he knows VFX inside and out, but the movies visibly felt much more digital than the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Some of the environments lacked the organic feel of real locations, and there were weightless action sequences that felt like a bunch of digital assets hitting each other without much impact. Jackson couldn't even do some of the in-camera tricks that he had done previously, such as forced perspective, because they had to make the movie ready for 3D release. Practical makeup and prosthetics were largely abandoned in favor of digital character creation, resulting in orcs and goblins that lacked the tangible menace of their practically created predecessors. The film's action sequences, particularly the barrel sequence and Goblin Town escape, showcase physics-defying digital acrobatics that prioritize spectacle over believability, which created a disconnect between the characters and their supposedly dangerous environments. Then there was the giant golden dwarf in Desolation of Smaug. Smaug looked decent enough, but the molten gold statue was probably one of the more artificial, plasticky looking shots of the film. Ian McKellen, famously, was driven to tears by the process. In his words, quote, "I was miserable. It may be my impression, but I don't remember a green screen on The Lord of the Rings. If Gandalf was on top of a mountain, I'd be there on the mountain," end quote. On The Hobbit, he often wasn't even in the same room as Martin Freeman or the actors that played the dwarfs, because they were digitally shortened and later added. The movies made money and got decent reviews, but the extensive CGI was criticized. I think the studios are mostly at fault here. Jackson didn't have enough prep time, and the decision to split the movie into 3 parts was only made after much of the filming had been done. Now they had more work to do, but not enough time to get it all done in. The high frame rate experiment was also mostly abandoned, as it made the film look cheap and artificial rather than make it more immersive. The trilogy's legacy is still complicated, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of over-relying on digital effects and the importance of restraint in franchise filmmaking, while also demonstrating how advanced technology can sometimes work against cinematic storytelling. Despite the epic scope of the Hobbit movies, they still lacked the epic nature of the Lord of the Rings movies. The Flash, which I actually saw in theaters, had a very troubled production. It had undergone multiple director changes, rewrites, and was stuck in development hell for years until it finally reached theaters under director Andy Muschietti. It was designed as both a solo vehicle for Ezra Miller's Barry Allen and a multiverse-spanning event that would reset the DC Extended Universe. Allen would travel across time and the multiverse, and, hopefully, revitalize the DCEU. The production faced numerous challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic, extensive reshoots, and controversial off-screen issues with its lead actor that threatened the film's release and the marketing. It's somewhat of a miracle that it got released at all. A lot of that, it seems, impacted the VFX as well. The Flash features some of the most criticized CGI in recent blockbuster history, with digital effects that appeared rushed, unfinished, and fundamentally unconvincing throughout the film. There was the scene in the beginning where he had to save all the babies from a hospital, but I think the creme de la creme of what looked the worst was the Chronoball sequence. It brought forth different incarnations of heroes throughout the years, such as Christopher Reeve, Henry Cavill, and Nicolas Cage, who almost played Superman once. They looked more like animatics more than final effects. Part of this is attributable to time. This movie had a lot of cameos, and in order to get those cameos, they needed to get the actors or their estates to sign off. That requires time and money, and once that's agreed upon, they still need to make time to get their likeness digitized. These kinds of things can go down to the wire, cutting into the time that the VFX artists have to get the effects right. The running sequences also got plenty of criticism. According to Andy Muschietti, they were supposed to look like that. In his words, quote, "We are in the perspective of the Flash. Everything is distorted in terms of lights and textures. We enter this water world, which is basically being in Barry's POV. It was part of the design, so if it looks a little weird to you, that was intended." End quote. That could be accurate, but I'm not so sure. Critics and audiences universally condemned the Flash's visual effects as unacceptably bad for a major studio blockbuster. The poor CGI became a dominant talking point in reviews and reactions, overshadowing other aspects of the movie. The movie got okay reviews, but it did collapse at the box office. Of course, The Flash was only the apotheosis of the DC Extended Universe's special effects issues. That is to say, it's only the worst of it, not the only example of it. There's the fact that Henry Cavill's mustache had to be removed via CGI for Justice League because he had grown it out for Mission Impossible Fallout and was unable to shave it. Then there's Cheetah in Wonder Woman 1984. To be fair, it's difficult to get human-animal hybrids right. Hell, I could have spent an entire section talking about the cats in the movie Cats, but opted not to, as I've talked about it recently. Suffice it to say that Kristen Wiig's Cheetah looks as bad, if not worse, than the cats in Cats. CGI is about attention to detail, which is something that the DCEU lacked almost throughout its entire existence. It's important to get enough small things right, especially if you're pouring in hundreds of millions of dollars. If enough of them are wrong, you just end up with a bad movie or a series of bad movies on your hands, squandering a golden opportunity in the process, which is basically what happened here. Over the course of a decade, the MCU became the most successful film franchise in history. Despite its missteps in the last half-decade, props where props are due. It revolutionized blockbuster filmmaking, established a new template for shared universe storytelling, managed to bring in a lot of characters without becoming overwhelming until late, and knocked out hit after hit for a decade. Kevin Feige's leadership produced dozens of films that have grossed billions of dollars and changed Hollywood's approach to franchise filmmaking. However, the studio's aggressive production schedules and reliance on CGI have led to increasingly noticeable problems with quality, particularly in recent years as the number of simultaneous productions has increased. There's a lot of core issues. 1. The work is split across a number of companies, sometimes more than a dozen. 2. Marvel seems to have a pretty big fix-it-in-post culture. The movie is ostensibly directed by a director, yes, but the movie seems to actually be made in the editing and post-production phase, with directors sometimes having little to no input. 3. Companies sometimes end up having a lot less time to work on a movie than they originally thought. One film that hits all of these is Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. I was going through the VFX houses involved in 2023's Quantumania, and these are some of them. Sony Pictures Imageworks, Industrial Light and Magic, Digital Domain, Moving Picture Company, Finn Design Plus Effects, Spin VFX, Rising Sun Pictures, Folks VFX, Barnstorm VFX, Base Effects, Pixelmondo, Mars, Luma Pictures, Atomic Arts, Territory Studio, and Stereo D. That's 16 different companies handling all of the effects for one movie. On top of that, because the movie's release date was shifting, it ended up being the case that the post-production schedule was shortened by 4.5 months. Now, these companies needed to do more work in less time. It's a little wonder that the effects in the movie ended up coming off as mediocre, especially MODOK and the Quantum Realm. Something like this over multiple films can make people reticent to spend money. which has been the case for Marvel as of late. The CGI problems have become increasingly apparent in recent films, with rushed post-production schedules leading to unfinished or unconvincing digital effects that undermines the film's spectacle. This is made all the worse by most of the CGI actually being decent, but that only makes the bad parts stand out all the more. There is Bruce Banner in Avengers Infinity War when Mark Ruffalo's head looks like it's floating atop the Hulkbuster armor. There is the Black Panther vs. Killmonger fight near the end of the first Black Panther movie. The VFX supervisor on the film, Daniel Rodriguez das Neves, commented on it saying, quote, "Black Panther was, for us, a last-minute project with very little time and team allocation. I know there's a lot of complaints on how bad the CGI looks, and I agree. But given the time and resources we had, this was the best we could do," end quote. Thor Love and Thunder had some obviously bad CGI, like the floating head, though some effects, like when they fight Gore in the Shadow Realm, is stylistically interesting. Black Widow had some notably bad effects. One of the more famous ones is when Florence Pugh's character, Yelena, blows up a turbine on a plane. And then there's Doctor Strange's third eye in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. The declining CGI quality is something a lot of people have called attention to. In this case, it seems attributable to how Marvel works in general. They have difficult deadlines, and it seems more important to meet the release date over achieving quality results. They could get away with it for a while because they had built up so much goodwill. That, however, seems to be running out. Thunderbolts and Fantastic Four got good reviews, but the box office results aren't what they used to be. Whether they can turn it around further remains to be seen. VFX work is an art and a science. The people that work on these movies are some of the unsung heroes in filmmaking, and they often get short shrift. When VFX turns out terrible, as it does with these movies, it's usually because there's not enough money, not enough time, or both. You can only fix so much in post, and what you can fix is technical, not fundamental. VFX has come a long way over the decades, but the people in charge of the people that make it still have quite a ways to go.